The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Hey, Fidelity. What's it cost to invest with the Fidelity app?
Start with as little as $1 with no account fees or trade commissions on U.S. stocks and ETFs.
That's music to my ears.
I can only talk.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Zero account fees apply to retail brokerage accounts only. Sell order assessment fee not included. A limited number of ETFs are subject to a transaction-based service fee of $100. See full list at fidelity.com/commissions. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE SIPC.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to Gone by Lunchtime. My name's Toby Manhire, and I'm joined today by Annabelle Lee Mather.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Ben Thomas.
Morena.
Te Aihe Butler.
Kia ora.
And most importantly, Te Aihe Butler's new dog, Shiloh, who is presently lying on the floor, staring plaintively out the window at the world going by, which in a way we all are, aren't we?
He's such a gentleman.
Yeah, he's lovely.
He's a lovely person.
Very chill, very friendly. Anyway, first day in the office for Shiloh.
He's such a sweet boy. Yeah. He's so well behaved.
Yeah.
And I think he's looking forward to a great pod this morning.
He looks unconscious.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
This is why we have to turn up the mix to wake up all of our regular listeners. It's New Zealand politics time again.
We don't discriminate on species in terms of keen Gone by Lunchtime consumers. We're going to talk today about a bunch of different bits and bobs. We'll cover school lunches. We'll cover Winston Peters. But let's start with the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon. And he has this week been in India. It's been a pretty successful trip on the whole, but it came after a pretty bleak couple of weeks. If we rewind back to some polls that came out that put Luxon underneath Christopher Hipkins and just over 20% in the preferred Prime Minister stakes, that seemed to set in motion, it set in motion alongside that Hosking interview, which we've talked about, which I think had a kind of outsized impact, set in motion a whole bunch of speculation, and there was a kind of week's worth of punditry about whether or not Christopher Luxon was on the precipice, about whether or not he'd been rolled. Duncan Garner fired up. It was like Duncan Garner back in the day, when he used to sort of do live crosses from his bedroom on the late news on 3 about how, X or Y was about to be, destroyed or defenestrated or whatever. Anyway, Garner was saying it's all on, there's no way back, he'll be rolled. Other people were a bit more cautious, but some of the more reassuring talk included that from Andrea Vance, who has some experience in matters of infighting in the National Party, having written the book Blue Blood, said, oh, come on, he's not going to be rolled. Well, not yet. I mean, he will be rolled, probably, but not straight away. And then the investment summit was held on the Auckland waterfront, which seemed to go down generally pretty well. They managed, National, to have some opposition MPs there. There was some pushback on some of the PPP stuff, the idea that whether or not you would have any private investment in the likes of prisons and other institutions like schools. But broadly speaking, it was at least an opportunity for Christopher Luxon to try and reset things, and then off to India. And the big thing that came out of that on Luxon's arrival in Delhi, Ben, was the announcement that talks would get on. It was to be in a month, and I think it's now in a week, on a comprehensive free trade agreement with India, which is something that Luxon had during the campaign. Seemingly, it seemed at the time that it was slightly on the hoof, said, we'll secure a free trade agreement with India by the end of the term, which seemed quite a bold pledge. And it still seems like a bold pledge. Although since that was announced, that negotiation, there's been a sort of suggestion from both India and New Zealand that it might be as soon as 90 or 60 days, which really does seem a long shot. In any case, at this stage, dairy is still involved will be involved in the talks, at least at the outset. What's your overview, Ben, of that broad period of days, of weeks, in which Christopher Luxon, we saw perhaps the worst and the best for him?
Yeah, and we're constantly reminded polling is a snapshot in time. So far, this is more like a kind of what's it called? Motion capture kind of. We've captured a snapshot of about a month in time where the National Party. The National Party itself seems to be a little bit on the rise relative to its coalition partners, which will give them a bit of hope. They seem to be on the decline vis-a-vis the Labour Party, which will sort of dash that hope. The government itself looking shaky, marginally behind a centre-left bloc on a number of most of the recent polls. And Luxon himself continuing really to underperform, I guess, on those preferred Prime Minister ratings. The caveat, I think, to that is that, look, he is continuing to play through. Those polls were sort of in the wake of the sort of Andrew Bailey departure, which is a little bit messy. And as, basically use the soundboard sound, the continuing economic malaise and gloom. And look, I actually think Luxon's had a pretty good few weeks. The investment summit, I think, went better than would have been expected, or at least better than I think some of the naysayers were sort of, or the doom mongers were sort of saying, rather than just the sort of polite sort of, New Zealand's a beautiful country afterwards, from the people who had come here to avoid Ramadan fasting, in their sovereign wealth fund jobs in the Middle East. Instead, there were, pretty firm commitments to participate in tender processes and real interest in specific projects from international firms, which is exactly what they were looking for. The 10 out of 10, I guess, high watermark would have been if they could have announced a deal there. But look, I think they'll be pretty pleased with how that went from a government perspective. And I think industry was pretty pleased by it as well, because there were 100 sort of stakeholders invited, but 50 of those were local players, iwi, consultancies, building firms, law firms, finance institutions. And so I think there was a lot of positivity coming out of that. I think the Indian tour the trip has been pretty successful as well. You've had that announceable of free trade talks beginning, a comprehensive free trade agreement with India, that might just mean that there's a section that says, for the sake of comprehensiveness, there will be 0% reduction in dairy tariffs, just to make sure everything's dotted and crossed. But, it does show movement towards those goals. There's a lot of activity. Luxon is actually pretty good with this photo op stuff. The shots of him playing street cricket. He's actually sort of in his element there. I think he really is more a salesman, but more of a traditional salesman than a political salesman. And I think this is sort of his element. So I think he's had, a good couple of weeks. The polls are obviously a lagging indicator. And look, there's no guarantee that a couple of good weeks is enough to sort of sway people's minds en masse. But I think he'll be relatively comfortable that they're heading in the right direction, at least in terms of performance. And, the issue will be that if there are continuing, low polling, that keeps the pressure on. But, in terms of the leadership speculation, there are big transaction costs to changing your leader, to doing a spill. You see that in opposition with National, obviously, and Labour before that, where the public sort of sees a mess and doesn't really want to get involved. Are there people in the cabinet who could do a better job as, in the traditional job of being Prime Minister than Luxon? Yeah, absolutely. Much more experienced politicians. Is it worth the cost of a spill? Not yet. Not with, sort of neck and neck, with the economy hopefully looking to dip up. People are looking for a rise in GDP tomorrow, and, hopefully the cycle has bottomed out. An immense amount of wood touching, basically humping the wood right now in terms of the overseas situation and, trade wars and developing risks like that. But, for all the things that Luxon himself can control, I think that, he's on a reasonable trajectory right now. And I think for that reason, I think just as Andrea Vance said, it would be pretty self-defeating, if you want to, think about it. The two most likely people who could succeed Luxon if there was a change, Nicola Willis, Chris Bishop, they were both involved in the Muller coup. They know the instability that it causes. They know the risks involved. Could Luxon go, if there was a triggering event, if his leadership was really called into question by a big mistake or something catastrophic, or by another year of bad polls or whatever, sure, but at the moment, it's just not worth, the cost benefit doesn't stack up. Why would you want to erase, the investment summit success, the India success, and get the focus back on internal politicking? It's not coherent right now.
I think that when you have to leave the country to come across as more likeable or successful, that's usually not a good sign. Certainly that was the case for Jacinda Ardern, who was, performed really well overseas while becoming increasingly unpopular at home. And I think we're seeing shades of that with Luxon. In terms of the investment summit, it may have gone well. There hasn't been a huge amount of media coverage about it, though, and I think probably the average Kiwi voter would not necessarily know what went down there or see what the tangible benefits of it will be to them in the immediate future. They just go to the supermarket and see that butter is $10 a block, that the school lunches program is going up in literally flames, and having the interview with Hoskins pushed into their news feed. So I think, obviously the heat is off at the moment because he's in another country, but I don't think that this spells the end of what's been a difficult period for Luxon. I think there'll be more to come. And I think when he comes home, there's going to be, in terms of the trip to India, he's going to be challenged over the decision to support India's membership into the Nuclear Partnership Treaty.
I'd missed that. And Chris Hipkins was bringing that up on the radio this morning.
Yeah, and I think, that's something that I think broadly most New Zealanders feel pretty proud of our track record on taking a stand against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And so for him to go to India to sign up to support their country to be a member, having not signed themselves the agreement to not proliferate nuclear weapons, flies in the face of a value that so many New Zealanders hold dear, and I think he'll probably end up running into a bit of trouble in the House over that, and again, creating more headlines that may not necessarily be very helpful to him at the moment.
And that's a good point. That raises something that I think is another thing that plays in Luxon's favour, is that, when he's speaking, he's actually been pretty good on foreign policy. When he's been speaking about, for instance, Ukraine, he's very much been talking about, the liberal world order. He's been talking about sharing values with the Ukrainians, and really sort of differentiating himself, I think, from what's happening in the United States, which I think will be good for centrist voters. There is sometimes a sort of weird tendency to kind of lump, say, this government in with what's happening in the United States and, parts of Europe. I think Luxon successfully marks out that territory, that he is much more of a, he's a Key, he's a Helen Clark, he's a, whatever, as opposed to, sort of, he's holding firm on, a realistic version of New Zealand's independent foreign policy, which is only ever going to be sort of as independent as we're allowed by sort of great power conflicts. But, I think he says a lot of the right things, for the base that he needs in the next election there.
I thought it was interesting that Modi took the opportunity to call out, the anti-Indian action, was it? In New Zealand. When I first read it, I was like, oh my God, has he heard about the Jamie Lee Ross, 2 Indians is worth 1 Chinese thing. What the hell? I thought that was quite an unusual statement to make, after the meeting.
Yes, well, it's such
had
a big
happened
part of
and it didn't bode well.
Of Modi's pitch, isn't it, the Hindutva element? And I thought Luxon handled that pretty well. In that
That's right,
he managed to quite diplomatically say that no undertaking was given. I think Modi's words were something like, "We having been given an undertaking that illegal activity relating to the voicing of Sikh separatist perspectives in New Zealand would be cracked down on." And Luxon said, well, we believe in free speech in New Zealand and we have a police force that we think, he sort of managed to deal with that quite adeptly. And it's interesting, when the idea of how is Luxon performing on foreign affairs more broadly, kind of better than I think I might have expected. There was also, going back to the investment summit, there was a quite artful sewing in of the current kind of broad world climate in terms of adding, I don't know how much that would have been there were it not for the Trump administration, but it felt like quite an artful way of saying what we offer. I mean, it's an extrapolation, I suppose, of the New Zealand as a bunker idea, as a bolt hole. It was kind of, we offer stability in a volatile world. We have consistent approach. Basically the nudge and a wink being, we know there's a lot of uncertainty and volatility out there. Come down to New Zealand where we are insulated from those.
Yeah. We'll give you citizenship if you're a billionaire.
No, that too. And then I think that was an important part as well of obviously in and of itself, it's a net positive to be able to say for a trading nation like New Zealand, a cork bobbing on the ocean, that a free trade agreement with the world's most populous nation is an option now, given that they're now, I think there's something like our 12th or 13th biggest trading partner. So it's, there's got to be potential there. Obviously, dairy is the big one, and could be a big sticking point. But that comes at a time when there's just this absolute bedlam emanating from the White House, playing out day by day, tariffs coming, tariffs going. We've got April 2 being, I think, the day when a whole bunch of more tariffs might be sprayed out around the world, including on New Zealand. And so it felt as though that it was a reminder that not everything is about America. That New Zealand can have trading relationships with other countries and not always be somehow, that aren't always subservient to whatever's going on in the States, which brings us, I guess, to the meeting this morning. I mean, we're talking at 9:30 on a Wednesday morning, and Winston Peters has just emerged from a meeting with Marco Rubio. And he hasn't, as we speak, we haven't seen, Winston Peters hasn't spoken to the media, but there have been kind of indications given that it was a positive meeting. It's quite either a well-timed or a dangerously timed meeting when you look at some of the engagements in the White House in recent weeks. I mean, this wasn't, it's been an interesting point of discussion. Would Christopher Luxon actually want to have a meeting with Donald Trump right now, given we've seen this procession of pantomime madness going on with, the likes of Zelensky and, the Irish Prime Minister and more. Annabelle, in terms of navigating that very minefield, do you think we're getting that about right, or would you like to see a more outspokenness on the part of our leaders, whether it comes to trade and our position on that, or Ukraine, or even Gaza, where tragically the ceasefire appears to be fraying, if not having broken in recent days. And would you like to see, I mean, there's a part of, I talked to David Parker about this and he was sort of a bit cautious, but there are previous New Zealand governments who you might imagine would have been a bit more, we want to stand up and speak loudly these values.
Well, I think, in terms of Gaza, New Zealand should have, I think, spoken out a lot more on that particular issue. In terms of Winston Peters and the meeting with Rubio, I think he, like many others, have already said that he is the right man for the job. The reality is that we don't have a lot of leverage with them, and this meeting is essentially a vibe check, and Peters is able to reflect a lot of the Trump regime's values back at them, the anti-DEI, nationalistic, grumpy, spontaneous. But no, I think, the best that I think we could get out of this meeting is Winston showing a respectful approach to their government, but you would hope that he also stands up for our values, for our independent foreign policy, and all of those things.
It's one of those times, I guess, Ben, when I think most people are likely to go, actually, Winston Peters, with his many, many decades of diplomatic experience, is the person for the moment. Thomas Manch made an interesting point on RNZ. Thomas Manch from Stuff made an interesting point on RNZ at the end of last week about that DEI stuff and whatever the latest members bill from New Zealand First on anti-woke.
Reforming the Public Service Act.
That's right. And that
DEI.
came swift on the heels of, getting wokeness out of banks and whatever. Made a point which hadn't occurred to me, which is that whenever you're meeting a foreign official, and Rubio may not have known he was meeting the foreign minister from New Zealand until an hour beforehand. Who knows? But you're given a briefing dossier, and included in that dossier will be recent comments made by the man you're about to meet, and that will include some stuff that looks surprisingly and to echo some sentiments coming out of the White House.
Yeah, if that is a tactical move or a strategic move by Peters, it would be very clever, and it may well be. Look, he is very canny. He has, one of the great paradoxes has been that the sort of rabble-rousing populist domestic politician has always been an outstanding foreign minister, and because of his sort of slightly simpatico approach, which I think, as Matthew Hooden pointed out, he was rehearsing and perfecting long before Donald Trump ever considered a bit into politics. Peters really is, the right man at the right time. Now, this still doesn't really change New Zealand's negotiating position much, which is very slim. But, there is a question, how much is to be gained by Donald Trump knowing anything more about New Zealand than it's the home of Bob Charles, which seems to be the current baseline sort of knowledge. And that's unclear, but I mean, we will have to engage at some point. We can't just sort of move through the Pacific like a hidden island from a 1950s horror movie or sci-fi movie. So yes, Godspeed, Winston, Godspeed.
Kia ora koutou, this is Toby Manhire, host of the spin-off politics podcast Gone by Lunchtime. Join me with Ben Thomas and Annabelle Lee Mather for a special live pod event April the 9th in Auckland at Q Theatre. We'll have bells and whistles and animals and children and special guests all gathered to discuss the state of the coalition government halfway through the term. That's April 9, Q Theatre. Tickets are available now from thespinoff.co.nz/events. Meanwhile, back in New Zealand, the acting Prime Minister with Luxon and Peters both abroad is David Seymour. He took the opportunity to announce, as ACT Party leader, an interesting departure or an interesting innovation, which is to stand at candidates in local elections. What do you, very, very quickly on that before we get to the other big David Seymour newsline of recent times, is it a net positive for local government elections to have parties attached to the candidates? I mean, my sort of broad view on this is local democracy turnout, local election turnout is so dire that it's embarrassing and something needs to be done. And if you can give people anything to cling to in order to inform their vote, then that's probably a good thing.
I mean, I don't have particularly strong views about it one way or another. I think it shows that, Seymour is feeling very confident that he's committed to building this, right-wing movement out further. I think that the challenge for him is that it becomes a lot of pieces to manage on the board.
Yeah.
And he's done an amazing job with his MPs in terms of keeping them really nice and tidy. But like anything, the bigger you get, the more difficult it becomes to be across all of that. So
a lot more Twitter accounts to scroll through.
Exactly. There's benefits, but there's also some major risk as well.
Well, I mean, the last election, ACT, I think, had between it was 3 or 5 candidates who were basically sort of asked to leave or sort of dismissed from the list when it turned out that they had sort of, views that ranged from sort of slightly excitable about Jacinda Ardern running death camps to anti-Semitism to conspiracy theories. And those were the sort of people in the high 30s. Now there's about almost 1,000 elected council positions in New Zealand. If you're running candidates in, even a tenth of them, look, that's that's a lot of Twitter accounts, a lot of social media accounts, a lot of people who are not well known to the party. I tend to agree with you, Toby, and Graham Edgeler, I think, made the same point on RNZ that there's very little information for most voters on most candidates in local elections, particularly in the bigger cities. You get to know a bit about the mayoral candidates, where it's sort of citywide. I think, they get a lot of coverage. Once you get into the council boards and particularly local boards and things like that, just, it really is total crapshoot, right? And, was it a 150-word blurb if you can be bothered reading that? Is it even that long? And so the more information you can provide to potential voters, the better. I think it's a terrible, terrible strategic decision for a political party. I think as Annabelle, you're saying, you don't have the same level of control over a councillor that you have over your caucus in Parliament. You don't have the same level of day-to-day management over them. A lot of these people will be cranks. That's the nature of local government. They will have their own weird ideas about local things that might run very counter to your actual sort of, national policies. And the chance of getting somebody who has eccentricities that you might not like associated with your party.
Beautifully said. You could get a job at MFAC.
Peccadillos.
Becomes much, much greater. National has stayed out of local government in terms of endorsing candidates for about 20 years. I think that was a very good decision. I think look, all the best for them. Again, probably good for local democracy. But I don't know it's a wise decision for political parties to do it.
Annabelle, David Seymour was probably pleased at a minimum yesterday not to be talking about school lunches, which have become a giant albatross sandwich around his...
A giant lentil ball. Hotter than the sun.
Yeah. I just jotted down some of the things that have happened to the school lunches, which have been, headline after headline after headline, sometimes day after day. They've exploded. They've been plastic infused. They've disappeared. They've been liquidated, or at least one of the major providers have. They've been frozen. And it's just been this kind of drip feed of story after story, which is inevitably attached to Seymour because Seymour attached himself to it. There have been a few attempted lines to rebut or deflect. There was the Marmite sandwich / Vegemite sandwich and an apple rhetoric that came from
Controversially,
from
someone said a banana.
banana. Yeah, because that bruises. Yeah. So you mean if you cut it carefully and put it in one of the plastic protective slots, it can be done. And then David Seymour on Q&A on Sunday explained that there are two New Zealands.
I love this one. It's
I like
so
the
good.
two New Zealands line. It kind of because it just feels like there's a real kind of I suppose pathos to it. Oh, here Ben's going to defend the two New Zealands. Let me just explain what the two New Zealands are.
Okay. Sorry.
Just so that listeners know what the two New Zealanders are. On the one hand, there's the wishy-washy, namby-pamby, self-loathing, nitpicking haters and wreckers.
Yeah, haters and wreckers.
Who just can't stop fixating on the fucking school lunches. And then on the other New Zealand of the
There's
two
the
New
bright
Zealands.
and breezy.
The bright, breezy, sensible.
Yeah.
Optimistic. The good ones. Ben, defend the two New Zealand doctrine.
I actually thought that the two New Zealand line was a pretty good one for rolling out kind of in campaigning in general.
Anything. You can just apply it to anything. Yeah. There are also two New Zealanders. There are two New Zealanders.
Well,
those who think it's a bad idea for us to stand candidates in local elections and those that don't.
No, I think he sort of started, I think, workshopping it around the time of the Jeep driving up the stairs. He said this shows what's wrong with New Zealand. Those people who say, there's two New Zealands. There's one New Zealand that will see a large cargo load that they need to get up the steps of Parliament sitting on the forecourt and say, that's impossible, it's too heavy to carry. And then there's another New Zealand that says there's a Jeep right there, and look, honestly, you sort of do see it because in the sense that I think a lot of, there's obviously like numerous legitimate complaints about the school lunches. It's going to be, it's going to continue to be an issue for the government until either the media get tired of it, the complaints stop, or all the children are dead. And but in the interim, there are some complaints that are, that seem a little overegged. Jack Tame, great interviewer, did a really good interview, but, saying, some of the kids were taking time out of their class to go and collect the lunches from the gate to deliver them to the classes. I mean, I don't know, have things changed? When I was at school, kids got taken out of class to take the rolls around class. They got taken out of class to do all this sort of stuff. I think there was a greenhouse that,
Or my favourite, to be the person to go to class and say, you're next at the dental nurse. And then everyone, murder house.
Yeah, now
literally the best job in school.
Yeah. There was a lot of school lunch trading as well. Good way of learning about the open market.
Yes.
The open unregulated market was the trade in school lunches.
Not allowed to do that anymore.
Well, and so in a way he's sort of right in the sense that there's probably three New Zealands, right? There's the one that thinks that going to the gates to get the school lunches is teaching the kids valuable lessons in business logistics and operations. There's another New Zealand that thinks it is literally impossible to move lunches from the gate to the classroom without destroying the education system. Like, literally impossible. They're helpless in this space of these circumstances. And then there's a third New Zealand that's probably like, send some of the fucking kids to get the lunches. Like, it'll take 10 minutes, Yeah.
The problem with the two New Zealand argument, two New Zealand types of people argument is that, you can apply it to the whole situation, which is that pre his intervention, there was two types of New Zealanders, one who were supporting and enjoying an amazing locally produced free lunch program that was providing healthy meals to tamariki to support their learning all around the motu and delivering all sorts of benefits to their local economies and to education. And then there was the type of New Zealanders who are penny pinching and resentful and wanted to save a few bucks, the type of people who, the cost of everything, the value of nothing. And so, but what I'm kind of fascinated about with how this is rolling out is a National kind of enjoying this because, he's been so nonchalant in terms of how you might deal with your coalition partner. Do you think National are quietly enjoying watching him getting roasted over school lunches and being able to say, look, we have every confidence that David is completely able to sort this out because this is his gig, and they get to kind of walk away from it. They don't really get to walk away with it because they're still associated with it, but I imagine they're enjoying, excuse the pun, seeing a bit of heat on him over this issue.
I don't know. Ben might have a better sense of that than me. My guess would be in moments, yes, but
in
more
moments,
broadly,
exactly, but more broadly, no, because it's damaging.
Look, a lot of politics involves holding two thoughts at once, right? And sometimes those thoughts are, I wish this problem would go away and leave the public arena, and that can coexist with the thought, yeah. Like it's just let them cook.
It's full of this weird. This whole thing is this weird paradox for Seymour in a number of ways. One, because that weird thing that happened where he missed a meeting with Erica Stanford, who is the education minister, and therefore you would have thought the person
Mark Dabson.
Mark Dabson. Yeah, we've got a real absentee crisis on our hands for associate ministers of education. But then there's clearly a sense in which he's slightly puffing his chest and going, well, actually, I am. The subtext seems to be, well, actually, I'm number 3 in cabinet, so I don't need to come when I'm called to your office. Then there are other paradoxes, like, for example, he didn't want any state-funded school lunches at all,
Yeah.
And so he's no longer able to make the argument that he would like to be making, which is a bit of what that sandwich and an apple line was intended as, which is this should be on the parents. That was their position going into the election. And then finally, which I think in a way is the most interesting one, he is overseeing and now inextricable from the personification of a state, centralized state operation that is providing a kind of one-size-fits-all, it's almost Soviet in a way, whereas surely the true, the act ethos, if it were to be followed through and you were to do school lunches, would be to devolve the responsibility and say, here's a coupon or some money, go and sort it out yourself.
That's right. And so, for instance, I copped a bit of flack apparently for saying that Seymour was excellent on Q&A on Sunday because I thought, he actually managed to mount a reasonably good argument over the course of it. But it was an argument that you would expect coming from a pretty good Labour politician, which is, look, we are delivering the largest food rollout in the country. We are, we have managed to reduce costs by scaling it across the entire country. And there is no room for individual deviation. Honestly, it's bewildering why Seymour took this on. He didn't have to. It's not his policy. It's National's policy. Whether he just saw it as a test case for cutting costs. Cecile Meyer has been doing some really good reporting for Business Desk about the procurement process. She reported that Pitapit and Subway both tendered for the contract, but they said they couldn't do it for less than $4 per meal. I think
Subway, mean.
That's a
great.
$4 really.
Yeah,
that's so good.
Yeah. And
$7 at the moment.
Well, they might give you all they might just but they might send the schools all of the leftover like seafood. It might just be balls of surimi salad.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that she reported today was that LaBelle, which has just gone into liquidation, which was part of the alliance providing the food, officials had said that their continued viability depended on getting that contract, and that they were in a pretty insecure financial position. Right. So it seems like, there may have been a bit of motivated thinking and wishful thinking in the procurement, because it seems the signs was, you can trim the fat, but you can't trim everything. You still have to be able to pay for a product.
You can trim the flavour and the nutrients.
Yeah.
But not the plastic.
You still empty calories still cost.
But this is the thing, right? Like, you talk about sort of problems in the procurement process. Those are happening everywhere all the time in a way, but they're so arcane. They're not relatable like what is literally going into the lunches of children around the country, and therefore
and because this is large scale, Seymour is in a way right. Hitting 99% on most days for on time delivery. That's fantastic. That's much better than Uber Eats, but at the same time, if you make the state responsible for it, people's expectations scale up accordingly because they see it as a right. And I think part of this goes back to what was the original purpose of the school lunch scheme. The original purpose of the school lunch scheme was not to develop the palates in a sophisticated way of future New Zealanders or whatever. It was to plug this gap of children who were going hungry and it was affecting their learning. I think they really need to start sort of maybe even going back to first principles and saying, what are we actually trying to achieve here? Is the coverage too wide? Is the coverage not wide enough? Is the budget not enough? But, even if they're hitting these targets, maybe the whole sort of objectives are misconceived or the problem definition has not been specific enough.
All of this talk has got me hungry, so I think we should wrap this up. So a big thanks to Ben, Annabelle, Tiahe, mostly Shiloh. Shiloh, well done.
Shiloh, you are wonderful.
Your first ever podcast. What a good boy. Thanks for that. We will catch up soon. It's a good boy.
The Spin-off Podcast Network.